Thank you very much, Simon. This is awesome. So yeah, my name is Thomas Maurer. I'm going to speak to you today about hybrid cloud management. And I probably need to extend this and not just say hybrid cloud, but also multi-cloud management, right? Because we are not just limiting this to Azure and on-premises. We're actually enabling this also if you run in a multi-cloud environment. And we'll talk about that in just a bit. So let me dive into this presentation. And again, I'm not necessarily going to show a lot of slides. I have a couple of them to illustrate a couple of things, but I want to show you some cool demos as well. So before I actually go into the demos, I want to quickly outline why we're actually doing this and why this is such a big deal, right? So we did some research, and obviously we figured out that like customer environments get increasingly complex, right? There's a lot of change happening with the cloud, but also with new technologies. And so we are seeing like customers working with hundreds and if not thousands of applications and managing these and taking advantage of these. And these can be very modern applications. They can run on PaaS services, containerized, even serverless apps. But then we also have a lot of traditional applications running in virtual machines or even physical hosts. We also see customers obviously using different types of infrastructure. They use their own data centers. They have their branch offices, factories, retail stores, edge locations. They use hosters for their workloads. So there's a ton of things happening, and they obviously need to have management for that as well. And then last but not least, what I already mentioned is the multi-cloud approach, right? We have customers who are, some of them are probably strategic in a multi-cloud environment. Other customers, they just started with one cloud provider and then later on, for example, switched to Azure, which, by the way, is a fantastic choice. But then they're probably not going to migrate everything, right, to Azure. And they still need to be in control of everything, even though they choose multiple providers. And so this obviously adds a lot of complexity. And we want to make sure that we, not just in terms of management, but also in terms of security and compliance and app deployments, for example, and cloud architecture in general can make it easy or easier for customers in that sense. So before I dive into Azure Arc, I also want to quickly speak out and say, hey, there's obviously a lot of reasons why customers are in a hybrid environment. There are probably there are reasons why they can't use the cloud. And so we want to help them to enable them wherever they are, right? If they have data sovereignty challenges, if they have network challenges where they have not a lot of bandwidth to Azure, or they don't want to rely on the internet connectivity for their workloads to run, there are reasons. And we offer a large set of services and products to actually enable our customers. It's not just one product which does hybrid, but in the set, we have a set of different solutions out there for our customers. Let's think about IoT, right? We have a rich set of IoT solutions. We have our Azure Stack family, which provides you with cloud-inspired infrastructure wherever you need it. And then obviously we talk about Azure Arc, and Azure Arc is actually one part of that is bringing Azure services to any infrastructure. So when a customer cannot use an Azure service in Azure, we try to bring that service to the customer. And then last but not least, that's what we're going to talk mostly about is the Azure control plane using Azure Arc, right? So that you actually can manage everything in a single control plane. And so let's dive into what Azure Arc is. And I quickly, one sentence. So if you look at what Azure Arc is, it's really extending the Azure management and Azure services to anywhere, right? And this is absolutely key because, again, customers are not just running their workloads in one place. They're probably running their workloads in different locations. They take advantage of the cloud. They build hybrid and multi-cloud applications and architectures. So that is where Azure Arc really comes into the game. And we offer different tool sets for this. So, for example, one is about exactly having that control, getting that central visibility and operations and compliance tools. But then also, obviously, we want to enable customers to bring these cloud native apps to anywhere and help them, for example, managing their Kubernetes clusters or deploying apps to these. And then obviously, if customers want to build applications running our PaaS services, for example, they should also be able to do that, not just in Azure, but also outside of Azure. So how do we do this, and how do we look at this in general? And let's dive into the technology a little bit. So with Azure, we have this great control plane, right, where we actually can manage all our Azure resources. Now, our customers told us, okay, hey, this is so great. I really get like a single control plane to manage all my Azure cloud resources. But what about the resources which are outside of Azure? And so that is what we actually brought in. So we are speaking about two different things here. So one is what we call the Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure. And that allows you to connect existing infrastructures such as servers and Kubernetes clusters, or Microsoft SQL Server, for example, to the Azure control plane using Azure Arc, and then take advantage of the Azure management services such as Security Center, update management, monitoring, and many, many more. And then the other part where we're going to have a quick look at today is the Azure Arc-enabled services part. So this is actually where we then enable customers to actually deploy Azure services wherever they need them. So instead of talking all of that on slides, let's just give you a quick look how that actually can look like. So here I am in the Azure Portal, and you can see here I'm in the All Resources page, right? And so you can see here every resource I have deployed in Azure. And everything basically has a name, has a type. You can see here, it can be a VM, it can be a virtual disk, a database, even public IP addresses, for example, are an object, right? And they're usually part of a resource group. They're deployed or joined to a location, and then they're part of a subscription as well. And you can obviously use tagging for that as well. Now, our customers told us, hey, this is great. But again, where are the resources which are outside of Azure? And so to actually illustrate that, what I want to show you here is, let's quickly filter for to list all my servers, right? So servers which are running in Azure, but also servers which are running outside of Azure. And you can see here, if I look for Arc, I can actually see I have a couple of Arc servers here already joined, and I will tell you a little bit more how I did that. But then obviously not just my Arc machines, I also want to have my Azure virtual machines here. So if I select these two, I can now see them, all my servers side by side in that single view. And you can see here, the blue ones are the Azure virtual machines, as you know them. And then we have the other ones here, which are my servers, which are running outside of Azure. But you can also see that they're basically part of a resource group. They're also part of a subscription, and they show up as an Azure resource, right? I can even use features like tagging, for example, here. So if I select a tag, like for example, cost center, I can select, okay, I want to see all my servers which are like part of these three specific cost centers. And if I hit that, I can take advantage of the native Azure capabilities for tagging as well. And that is because it is now a native Azure resource, right? Even though the server is running outside of Azure, we still create that native resource in Azure, so you can take advantage of all of that. You now might say, well, Thomas, this is great to get some visibility, right? But I need to do more. And I completely agree with that. So one thing I want to show you here is when it comes to compliance. So for that, we are using Azure Policy. And Azure Policy is really there to get control over your Azure environment. But what a lot of people don't know, there's a feature called Azure Policy Guest Configuration, which also helps you to not just configure the Azure environment, but also, for example, if you run virtual machines within Azure, to actually control the operating system, right? Think about group policies on steroids in an example. And with Azure Arc, we can now extend this to resources which are outside of Azure. Now, I can simply go and have a set of policies which we already have built in for compliance reasons. Like if I go, for example, to create a new assignment here, I can basically select an initiative here, which is basically the policies, different policies here. So you can, as you can see, you can define your custom ones, but we have a set of built-in ones, which are probably very interesting to you. And some of them are technology focused, right? Like let's make sure that Defender for SQL agents on virtual machines is deployed and so on. But then we also have a lot of them who are actually based on industry certificates. So, for example, we have for FedRAMP, we have ISO, PCI, IRS, UK NHS, and so on, which you can select. Now, in my case, I deployed a very simple one, which actually goes out and audits virtual machines or physical servers as well, like servers in general, for insecure password settings. So I could set this up now, but that would take obviously a while. And so what I'm going to do here is, like in a good cooking show, I already prepared this policy, right? So we don't have to wait for it. So if I want to now see my compliance state of my environment, I can simply hit compliance. And now you can see a couple of different things. First thing, you can see that I'm actually doing a very bad job when it comes to compliance. And secondly, you can see here all the actual policies assigned. And if I click on this one, this is actually the one I just showed you. And you can see here I'm not compliant with that. And if I scroll down, I could even see the different policies itself, for example, password age and password length and so on, which are not configured the right way. Now, this is obviously interesting to know, but if I'm in charge of compliance, I also want to see like what resources are actually not compliant, what servers are not compliant. And so if I hit on compliance button, I can now see here, okay, these are the servers which are not compliant. And if I have a closer look here, I can see these are my Azure VMs. Here you can see resource type Microsoft.compute/virtual machines. And as well, my Arc servers. So this is Microsoft.hybrid compute machines. And so I can see here, I basically have a compliant view about all my resources. And again, this is not just limited to servers. We can also look at, for example, SQL servers or Kubernetes clusters as well, and then do much, much more. Now, how do we actually do this? Or what did I just show you? So if I go back to the slide deck quickly, and no worries, there are more demos to come. What I just showed you here is a high-level architecture of how Azure works. So when we are working with Azure as a customer, we're basically using tools and experience like the portal, the CLI, PowerShell APIs, and so on to actually interact with Azure Resource Manager. Now, Azure Resource Manager provides all these great benefits to manage resources at a large scale, right? Like tags, grouping, subscription management, role-based access control, policies, logs, and so on. And if you look at then, we also offer a ton of different management services like monitoring, update management, containers, and so on, to actually manage these Azure resources, right? But again, customers do not just have Azure resources. And so what they did before was they have their own management tools, their existing management tooling to manage resources which are running on premises or at other cloud providers. Now, with Azure Arc, we're basically building that bridge between the Azure Resource Manager and the resources which are outside of Azure. So you can actually get a representation of all this stuff within Azure. And you cannot just use it in the portal. You can also use that using ARM templates. You can use that using the CLI or PowerShell and so on. And you can still keep on using your existing tooling, right? We don't want to create any dependencies which are like for your business critical applications if you don't need to, right? You can still use them, but you get that extended benefit basically using our management tools. So what can we actually manage if I talk about Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure? So we have, for example, servers, Azure Arc-enabled servers, so we can manage that. We can actually manage Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters and Azure SQL servers. And I'm going to show you that in just a bit here. So let me quickly go back to the demo here. So how do I actually manage that? If I go to the Azure Arc page, or the Azure Arc Center within the Azure Portal, this is the one place where you would go to manage all your Arc resources. So what you can do here is you could onboard new servers and new infrastructure, new Kubernetes clusters, and then they will show up in the Azure Portal. Now, what does that actually mean? How do I onboard the resources? It's very simple. Basically, what you need to do is download the agent, install the agent, and register it like that machine or that Kubernetes cluster with Azure. That's very simple. And we help you by generating a script to do so. And then the machine, after a couple of minutes, it will pop up in the Azure Portal. And you can see here it looks like this. So, for example, if I click here on one of my servers, you can see here it actually now looks like an Azure resource, right? It's part of a resource group. It's part of a subscription. You can also see some additional local information here. That server is actually running in my local data center, or basically underneath my desk here. And then you can see here on the left side, we get all the good stuff you get from all the Azure resources, like the activity log to audit, like who has done what. We get role-based access control, so we can actually take advantage of Azure Active Directory to see who has access to that resource or enable people to have access to that resource. We can do like things like get security center recommendations. So for example, here you can see here that there are a couple of things I need to do. I can also, for example, take advantage of extensions. So I can deploy, for example, a custom script extension to deploy a script to that machine. Or I can take advantage of, for example, log analytics and Azure Monitor to actually get some monitoring information here from that specific system. So you can see here that this server doesn't do a lot, but you can see here CPU utilization, memory utilization, disk and network utilization as well, right? I can also get a dependency view and much, much more here. I can also do some update management. So if I want to patch that server, I can directly do this and control this out of the Azure Portal. So you can see here that this actually is not compliant because this server has missing patches. So I could actually go out and just deploy, schedule a new update deployment. Again, there's much, much more to show. But what I want to show you next is the Kubernetes cluster management, right? So I also have a couple of Kubernetes cluster running outside of Azure, and I want to manage these as well. So what I can do here is I can actually go out and have a look at this cluster here. You can see here on the left side, I also get all the good stuff like monitoring, policies, and all that stuff, security center, all the stuff or a lot of stuff I also get for server. But then what I want to show you here is how we can actually manage apps and do a GitOps integration to actually manage that. So if I look at GitOps here, I can actually deploy that configuration and say, hey, I want to deploy, for example, an application to that Kubernetes cluster. So what I did here is I have a Git repository down here where my application and my application configuration is stored. And I said basically to my Kubernetes cluster, okay, pull that application from there and then look for changes to that application. And so as soon as there is a change, please also apply that to the cluster. And so what I can show you, I took all my skills basically to create a new application here, which is basically a very simple application. It says, let me quickly refresh here. It says hello. So that is what the application does. And then I want to change that. I want to say, it should not just say hello here. It should say hello Cloud Summit. So what I go here and change that. So this is my Git repo. And now I'm doing something. Please don't repeat that at home. This is really just for me right now. So I'm going to directly do a change in the main branch here. So let's say hello Cloud Summit. Now, well, since I'm still a good admin, I'm still going to at least do commit message here and then commit that change. And again, don't do that at home. It also works with obviously approval steps and different branches and so on. But now if I go back, what you can see here in this config, this now goes out every 3 seconds basically to see if there is a change. And so we can see here, okay, go from that Git repo and basically look for that change. And if I now go back and talked long enough, if I now refresh my application here, you can see here it says Hello Cloud Summit. So I can do a couple of different things there, obviously, not just changing like a message, but this, you get the example, the idea of that. So there's much, much more we can do, but let's go quickly back to the slides. What else we can do, or have a quick summary on what we can do here. So with Azure Arc, we can actually manage servers. Again, you saw that, how that works, how we can organize and take advantage of the security features and management features we have with Azure Arc. We can do the same thing or similar things, or even more, if you will, in some cases for Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters, where we can actually go out and do, for example, that GitOps deployment, where we can do monitoring of our Kubernetes clusters, as we can do it, like, for example, as we do with an AKS cluster, right? But we can do that with Kubernetes clusters outside of Azure, running basically on premises or even at other cloud providers. And then we can also connect to these clusters. So if you need to do some configuration changes, if an admin or a developer needs to go out and do some changes, we can do that as well. So that is pretty cool stuff we can do there. So this is one part about hybrid cloud management, right? We get that single control plane. We can attach existing resources to it, like servers and Kubernetes clusters, and then actually go out and manage these and take advantage of that cloud native management tooling we have in Azure. The other part I promised you is the Azure Arc enabled services part. And that basically allows us to deploy services to resources or deploy Azure services outside of Azure. So let me quickly show you how that can look like. So again, if I go back to the Azure Arc page here, we had here the infrastructure management But then on the bottom, you can see here the services, right? So these are some of the services we currently Arc enabled. And what we have here is an interesting piece here. So we call that custom locations. So in my case, I defined 2 Kubernetes clusters as custom locations where I now can go out and deploy Azure resources. So to quickly show you how that could look like is here. If I create a new app service, I could just create new. And then I would obviously select a resource group. Let's select this one, and then maybe give that a name. So see, let's do Cloud Summit, and then I need to choose a region, right? Where do I want to deploy this? And this is nothing new. I've seen that before. But the cool part here is that I cannot just select an Azure region. I could also select now my custom locations, right? So these are now basically in my own data center. You can see here, Tom's data center. That doesn't really sound like a Azure region, right? Or I can even do that to another, deploy that to another cloud provider. So how cool is that? I can now deploy a large amount of Azure services, not just in Azure, but also at other locations. So I could go out and go through, obviously, the setup. I can also, again, use ARM templates to do that. I can use like the CLIs to deploy that as well. I can use native tooling within Visual Studio Code, for example, as well. So if I want to use that, I can do that as well. So that is pretty cool stuff we have there as well. And so with that, let me quickly talk a little bit what's actually there. So in this case, I saw like when we talked about Azure application services, which are currently in preview. So you can go out and deploy, for example, app service functions, logic apps, API management, event grid outside of Azure, which is pretty awesome. And then this obviously enables a couple of different scenarios for developers where now you cannot just build these cloud native applications in Azure, but then also take that and bring that back to like basically any infrastructure where you want to run it. But it's not just about applications, right? Most applications also need databases. So one thing which is also already generally available is Azure Arc enabled data services. And this allows you, for example, to run Azure SQL managed instances in these places as well. And then you get not just a SQL database, but you get actually the Azure SQL experience as a managed service where we take care of the updating process, of the security and so on. And you can actually go out and deploy that. And the only thing you actually need is a Kubernetes cluster, right? So you need to have an on-prem Kubernetes cluster or a Kubernetes cluster running another cloud provider as well, and then connect that, define that as a custom region, as I just showed you, and then you can actually go out and deploy that. In the terms of data services, you can even go and do that in a disconnected environment as well. So what does that give you? So if you think about if you're a cloud architect or developer, you can now use your existing tooling and your existing skills to actually deploy these services or these applications to your infrastructure using, for example, the GitOps techniques to deploy to your Kubernetes cluster. But then you can also take advantage of the Azure services, of the cloud native services, for example, like Azure SQL and functions and web apps, and keep on doing that. Doesn't matter where they're actually running. So this gives you the kind of like flexibility you want to have there. Now, one last thing I actually want to mention. If you, for example, want to deploy this now in your data center, you're saying, well, I don't have the knowledge really to like build up a Kubernetes cluster, right? I don't just want to, for example, do that. We also offer a solution called Azure Stack Hci, and this is basically an infrastructure solution doing virtualization where you can then run Windows and Linux VMs and then run different applications inside these VMs, right? This is also a great solution if you look at VDI and so on. But a service which we also bring to Azure Stack Hci is AKS. So the Azure Kubernetes service cannot just run in Azure, but can also run on Azure Stack Hci. And so that enables you then to run basically all the containers or containerized applications you have. But then also the Azure Arc enabled services I just showed you in your own data center locations, and then obviously build your cloud native applications. And this is great because AKS on Azure Stack Hci, again, is kind of like deployed as a service on top of it. Very easy to deploy, to go forward with it. And you can deploy that in your own data center. And you don't need to have all this, like, I build it by myself experience. So you can have the full stack Microsoft if you want to. But again, it's not necessary, right? You can also just use other Kubernetes clusters like OpenShift and so on to do similar things as well. So with that, I just want to tell you a little bit where you can find more before I'm actually done. So if you're looking at like this hybrid and multi-cloud approach and want to dive deeper into what I just told you, especially when it also comes to management, have a look at the Cloud Adoption Framework. We now have a special scenario for hybrid and multi-cloud guidance, basically, where we actually bring you that information. And this is, again, a lot of awesome stuff we basically developed together with our customers, the engineering teams, and so on, focusing especially on these hybrid and multi-cloud approaches, talking about the control plane and so on. And then we have a ton of different services, additional information like Microsoft Learn. Highly recommend to check that out. We have reference architectures and so on. So there's much, much more to learn. Again, I have a couple of links inside here where you can actually go and find more. Also check out Microsoft Docs. And last but not least, check out the Azure Arc Jumpstart guide to actually deploy quickly these different technologies. So with that, I want to say thank you. I hope that provide you a great overview.